Lab Guy here. Let's continue building this board. At this point, I'm going to add an old-fashioned terminal strip to use for my high current connections, the power supply inputs and the load connections where the deflection yoke will connect to this unit. Little do I realize at this time, as I happily build away, is that terminal strip doesn't have enough terminals. Two of the terminals on the terminal strip also serve as the ground connections and the mounting tabs, so I have to cut away the capped on tape where the tabs on the terminal strip will mount so that they can make contact with the ground plane on the circuit board. The terminal strip is held to the circuit board by two number 4 screws and two captive washer nuts.
There it goes.
The board's looking pretty good at this point. We now have terminals for the high current. Many more things to add. I think I'm going to add the electrolytic capacitors next. Yeah, that's the ticket. Coming up, electrolytic capacitors. This is just a fitting, but it looks pretty good. The 6 electrolytic capacitors have been put in the board with just the leads bent over. At this point, I'm going to ground all 6 of them at once. I'm going to use some solder braid, which I'm going to tack on the top of the board, wrap it around underneath and come up the other side and tack it on the other side. It runs right across the top of the pins of the capacitors that I want to attach to ground anyways. After that bridging connection is made, then I will go along the length of it between the capacitors and place a jumper at each point back to the top of the board to connect to the ground plane there. So the actual run on the ribbon cable, the distance will only be the distance from one of the capacitor pins to one of those ground jumpers to the top of the board. So the ground impedance for this is pretty good for a hand-built compromise. Now I could have left the ground leads bent out and not put them through the board in the first place and solder them directly to the ground plane on top, but that would have taken a quarter or half an inch of space on the board, and as you can see, space is getting to be a premium now.
It's almost inaccessible.
I'm making the first of the top ground connections here. 2 wires are poked up through the board and bent over so that I can solder them flush to the ground plane. On the bottom, I bend the other 2 ends over, which are in the form of a loop, over the solder wick and solder it down. And now that point on the solder wick is tied to ground. So as you can see, going from that point to the right, it reaches the edge of the circuit board in about 1 inch, a little over 1 inch, with a capacitor on that segment. On the left side of the ground solder connection is the next capacitor, and the next ground connection will go between that capacitor and the one following it, all the way across the board until I've put a ground between every single pair of capacitors.
Okay.
It's time to add the plus and minus 15 volt power rails. One will go to 3 of the capacitors, and the other will go to the other 3. I'm using twisted single conductor 22 gauge bus wire for this function. By twisting it, it lowers the inductance and makes it carry more current. You see, I've prepared 2 pre-cut pieces, which will run from the terminal strip and around the bottom of the board, and then ultimately to the 3 capacitors that each one goes to.
Hot. Oh no. I keep hooking it on things. Alrighty. There we go.
There. All 6 electrolytic capacitors are now fully installed. 3 for plus 15 volts and 3 for minus 15 volts. See you in part 5.